if we hear a lot of people saying the same thing, we tend to believe that thing. This stuff is who says it louder and more often. LLMs are really good at scaling that. Instead of one person saying it really loud and really often, that one person can be 1,000 people, 10,000 people, how much you want to pay OpenAI in tokens number of people, right?
Really excited for agentic AI, so I can just start getting this message out there.
I mean, you joke about that, but that is the truth of it. There are identities that can be created that are incredibly compelling. If you're detecting that it's trying to create 1,000 fake identities saying the same thing, that is an attack vector that they need to cover for. Unfortunately, unlike the robots, we're all human and we have blind spots. Unless the most creative people in the world work at OpenAI or Anthropic, then you're not going to cover all of those base use cases. It's very optimistic to think that that is something they will always prioritize over everything else.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm biased. I think that's something that should be prioritized over everything else.
Today, our guest is Sugin Liu. Sugin is a staff data scientist at Cash App and has held data science roles spanning fintech to social media to enterprise software to consulting. In this episode, we'll break down how AI evolved from simple rule-based systems to today's powerful large language models. We'll also discuss how AI isn't just learning language, it's shaping it, and what that means for the future of content moderation. And finally, we'll examine one of the biggest risks in today's AI-driven world, misinformation. If you work in AI, data, product, or you just care about how online spaces are shaped, this episode will give you a deeper understanding of the invisible forces behind content moderation. If you enjoy this conversation, subscribe to Data Neighbors in your favorite podcasting app and YouTube. It's the best way to stay updated, and it helps us keep bringing you great content. With that, let's dive into our conversation with Sugin Liu. Hey listeners, welcome to another episode of Data Neighbors with Hi Sarabi and Sean. Stoked to have a guest here today, one of our friends and former colleagues, Sugin. Sugin's currently a staff data scientist at Cash App. Welcome to the show, Sugin.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to be here.
Welcome to the show. This is not serious at all.
Well, I just mean, it's one of the few times, I think, where we've all been in the same room in a meeting and I'm not actually being paid for it. And so, yeah, I'd probably agree that it's not as serious.
You're not being
usual.
paid for this? Hi, I'm getting paid for this, right?
The payment is deferred down to the future.
Free guest passes to all of highest properties.
Exactly. Yes. So Sugin, you're currently a data scientist at Cash App. You've kind of had a diverse journey. You started out at PwC in consulting, like me. Later on, you were working at SAP. Eventually, you worked at as a data scientist at Nextdoor, where we all met. I think to kick it off, I want to talk a bit about your role at Nextdoor, where you're, addressing these complex problems around user-generated content, specifically, trust and safety and moderation. So I assume we're not talking about humans manually reviewing every single piece of content. I imagine that's not possible with the volume. So I guess to get into it, I'd just like to know a little bit about how do you use a machine to understand human language, especially when harmful content can be subtle and contextual and ever-changing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack in the question that you asked. I think there's a lot of different components that sequentially build upon each other for us to get to where we need to be. You mentioned it's probably not manual review for every single piece of content. I mean, you're right, but I think funnily enough, and we're referring to content moderation specifically, but funnily enough, kind of the ground truth for content moderation these days is still very much having some people come in and review an initial set of data, right? And it's kind of one of those things where you're like, oh, machine learning is so complicated, but when you boil down to that's how you trigger that at the start of the chain, it is often quite still manual. That was the case for some of the stuff at Nextdoor, but even with the big guys like YouTube and all this kind of stuff, they have their violative content rate and all those different things that is essentially the basis for their models, right? And I think that's where it starts. And then the next part is, how do we really scale that? Where machine learning kind of data comes in isn't so much how do we just remove that altogether? It's how do we take the work of, 100 people and then apply it to hundreds of millions of pieces of content. Because obviously they can't work 24/7, 365 days a year. And so that was kind of one of the things that you kind of have to think about in the trust and safety or content moderation space.
Cool.
But I'm happy to dive into any of those in more detail.
And just for the audience to be familiar, if they're not, what we're talking about here is, suppose Facebook, you see a feed of content. So it could be other people's posts and stuff like that. And some of them could be pretty bad. Like, some people could be complaining. Some people could be spreading fake news, misinformation, and stuff like that. And what we're talking about here is how do you actually identify those bad stuff in the sea of hopefully good things that you see.
Yeah, I think that's good context, and it's also interesting to dive into the concept of good and bad content, right? Like good for who and bad for who. From a social media perspective, good is stuff that kind of drives clicks and engagement, and bad is stuff that doesn't. But then kind of the ethics and that pesky thing called morals kind of gets in the way, where obviously you don't want to be generating clicks off of illegal content, first of all, right? Like if you have misinformation, discrimination, God forbid, kind of stuff even worse than that, it's first of all not legal for you to be making money off of that anyway, not legal for you to be showing that to anyone.
Right.
But then there's more like gray area where it comes to stuff that might be a bit uncivil and might not be great to see, but technically isn't illegal. Like with that kind of stuff, do you still want to drive engagement? Because it does drive engagement. We've kind of seen that in the past, and we saw that at Nextdoor as well. Or do you want to remove that because that's where you ethically as a company takes your stand, right? And so yeah, good and bad content can have lots of different definitions. But I think in the content moderation space, bad is just anything that's illegal. That's the stuff that is like for sure bad and is very much policy driven. And again, policy is not systematic. It's something that a team comes up with. And then everything else is not necessarily good. It's just not bad, right? And so like once you remove the realm of bad, the rest of it has a bit more grayness and ambiguity to it.
In the world when there's so much ambiguity, like we also get into the world of subjectivity, right? Like certain people may think this is, like gray area. Some people would be like, hey, this is definitely, and things like that. How do you think about that trade-off / dynamic, or do you actually deal with it at all?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting thing, I think, in content moderation, is that in the ambiguous space, there's a few things that you can really optimize for, right? Because at the end of the day, it's kind of an optimization problem, and you're just changing what you're optimizing for. If you're optimizing purely for engagement and clicks and all of like the metrics that drive your top line revenue, and then for smaller companies your next round of funding, then that's kind of, as long as we follow the law and remove everything that we're not legally allowed to show, we're just going to bump up and promote everything else that drives engagement. And so if you know what type of content gets clicks, then you just kind of have that cycle. And so there is also a degree of like ignorance that you choose to opt into, right? Where you're like, I just have this machine optimized for clicks and optimized for people coming in and viewing this content. It's not me that's making the choice. You just have this other machine that promotes things that optimize for this specific metric, and you just like let that fly. You let it out into the wild. I think the other one is where you can take a stance as a company. I think, credit where credit is due. Nextdoor did try and have a stance on what they wanted on the platform, right? We wanted, at the time, we wanted it to be kind of a kind platform with less incivility. And so we had policies around like, not you shouldn't say, but rather how you say it and how you treat people. But then those things are very difficult to put borders around because it's very subjective. Like what is offensive is highly subjective. And therefore, even at the like the human level, it's very difficult to get good precision and recall and accuracy in general in, defining what is uncivil. And so even if the human labels are not great quality and don't really serve well to capture the concept of what you're trying to, drive across, then obviously the machines learn from the humans and the machines also fail. And so I think, there's a degree of practicality in how you actually manage to achieve like true or false in this ambiguous gray area. But that's probably why most companies just do what I mentioned at the beginning, right? They just optimize the clicks and then remove everything that is actually illegal and easy to define as illegal.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Something offensive is based on the context. Like culturally in your community or you as a person, like, is this actually offensive, or is someone very obviously making a joke that a human would understand that, but a machine might not because it takes it literally? A way to kind of detect sarcasm.
Yeah, I was trying to define like sarcasm, right? It's kind of like a toy version of the justice system that we have, because if someone's always like guaranteed the right to a trial and the right to kind of go through and this justice system and have people share their opinions on things. And that is a perfect example, I guess, of even something so ingrained in our culture of like what is legal and illegal still has to go through this rigorous vetting process.
Yeah.
And like the same can be said, obviously, with much lower circumstances or consequences about sarcasm, right? Like if someone says this thing and then someone gets offended by it, if we had like this mock trial where we had 10 people be like, oh, was that really offensive or was he just kidding around? Like that would probably resolve the issue, but it's not practical in the sense of we can't get 10 people to review this thing every time, right? And so the thing that we did try to do was, at Nextdoor anyway, was we had this panel of reviewers for content to try and generate our ground truth. And we would look at where these people agreed on whether stuff was policy violating or not. And, I'm not going to give the exact numbers of how many people agreed, but it was much lower than you'd expect from like a panel of experts, right? And it's like, it's not me throwing them into the fire or under the bus or anything. Like, it's a very difficult problem to be like, is this offensive or is this uncivil? And so I think that's where you can work towards a happy medium of we are going to enforce the things that people can agree on, but then the things that they can't agree on, that's probably a policy problem. And so the policies that they can't agree on need to be revised and become more concrete. And that way you're coming at the problem from two angles. You're both, getting better agreement rates with the policies that you do that are concrete. And then the other policies are slowly being improved as time goes on. And so I think everything is iterative. It's never like as simple as we built this amazing model, it kind of fixes everything.
Right.
I mean, it's such a, let's call it like challenging problem, right? Like there's absolutely no ground truth. Like things could be subjective. I think one analogy to the world that we live in today is like evaluations for AI models, right? Like how do you actually evaluate the responses from LLMs, and if they're good, if they're bad, like that's always a challenge. And it lends some analogy to kind of what you talked about. So a follow-up question to that, if you have thoughts around it, Sugin, is in today's world with large language models that we have at our disposal, would that have helped in your pursuit in trying to establish these ground truths and just making sure we're better at identifying those sort of hurtful, harmful content?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I think to use those models, you have to have at least some faith that those models are true, right? Like the evaluation of those models is a different problem to like whether or not you use those models in your actual practical application. Because one depends on the other. Like we assume that the models have been evaluated and are pretty good. And so if they are, then we could potentially use them as like agents in that panel of reviewers for content where we generate our ground truth. Like that could have been helpful. And that was something that we were actually beginning to do at the time, which was we would run these like pieces of content, like user generated content, mostly text at Nextdoor, through kind of these LLMs. And then we would have that as an additional vote on top of the people in the panel that we had voting already.
Yeah.
And that would, it would either give us an extra vote or it would allow us to remove one person down the line if we saw that that vote was reliable and accurate, to remove someone from that panel and replace them with that LLM. So I think that's one way that we could have been doing things. I mean, just to kind of throw stuff at the wall, I think there could also be uses in generating policy. If we found that certain policies were incredibly ambiguous, we'd just be like, okay, well, this is what we're actually trying to accomplish with this policy. Can you make it very concrete and enforceable repeatedly across different people? And that could, generate ideas for our policy teams to then hopefully refine and come back with better policies.
Yeah, so it creates like the feedback loop more. It is an interesting problem because it's like already within your panel, there's subjectivity, and then you train an LLM to try and make it representative of that panel. Even if it was like really representative of the panel, there's no way to quantify if it's correct or not because it's subjective. But then you also have to quantify, is the LLM representative of the panel? So it's like another degree removed.
Yeah, exactly. It's unlike a typical like engineering problem where there's kind of a right answer and you can kind of measure that right answer. It's very much every single thing is right in a way. And so, but you don't know like in which way it's right, because those ways in which things are right is like a latent feature, right? And so, yeah, I think we deal with it in society as well. Right now, I think a lot of policies for these big tech companies are changing. And along with, I don't want to make like any passing judgments on the politics of the US, but things are shifting in a certain direction, and that those shifts are also being felt in the policies of a lot of these big tech companies. And so that's even the stuff that is like illegal and completely out of the question. Like, that stuff is shifting. The stuff that's meant to be very concrete and easy to enforce and ground truth, right?
Yeah.
Those things are shifting. And so not only is this problem kind of difficult in a given point in time, but the ground truth shifts over time as well. And so I think this can't be like an exercise of we're going to build a model at this time based on these labels given by this panel. It's we need to keep going and making sure that, what is right over time, because that's just how the justice system and human social interactions evolve in the real world.
Hey, one thing I just want to highlight for the audience here is this is really fascinating stuff. And especially for those who are, let's call it like in the cross between, hey, I'm interested in data and I'm interested in the social political scenes, and I'm trying to figure out like, hey, how I can work my way towards things like that. Like, this is exactly the type of things that could be done in that space where we're solving extremely ambiguous problems that data is very much indispensable in trying to help inform the decisions or course of actions. And, like, I think it's not getting talked about a lot out there because a lot of problem sets, a lot of examples, probably from other podcasts or from this one so far, has been very black and white, as in like, hey, here's a problem, go solve it, or here's an objective, go solve it. Now, here, what we're talking about is, hey, if the objective itself is in itself unmeasurable, what can we do here? And so, like in this podcast, we're trying to bring as diverse of problem spaces, people, guests, and topics as much as we can to kind of give the audience a broad sense of what's possible. So just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, if you find this kind of content fascinating, make sure to like and subscribe. Drop a comment in the comment section and we'll DM you Sugin's Instagram handle so you can DM him directly via Instagram. I can send you his WhatsApp as well.
It's
Just subscribe.
As someone who's worked in content moderation a lot, that has definitely informed the privacy policy on my Instagram account. So, if you do follow me, I will be very unlikely to respond.
Yeah, I was just thinking kind of while you were just talking about that subjectivity and stuff, and how a lot of the practice sets or whatever are like black and white. I feel a little more comfortable maybe with the ambiguity of trying to evaluate LLMs, because as data scientists, there's still a lot of uncertainty even in an A/B test when we compare some of the work that like data scientists do around causal inference to like machine learning engineers have historically done, where it's very deterministic and they can train a model and know that they have this accuracy or precision or RMSC. You'd get questions on the causal inference model around, but how do you know it caused that? Well, you don't. You don't know for sure, but if you do these peer reviews and the logical like explanation of everything, and trying to account for as much as possible, then you're getting a lot closer than you were before.
Yeah, I mean, the other components of that too is like in previous few episodes we talked about like how to future proof yourself from like, for example, like AI is taking your job and stuff like that. But like inherently a lot of, and some of the conclusions we drawn is like your ingenuity, your problem solving ability, your ability to scope out solutions and things and deeply understand what you're solving for and how to add value, that's never going to be replaced. And as long as you kind of know, like, for example, in this sort of problem space is like there's a lot of judgments that needs to happen, and you need to apply a whole lot of solid, sound decision makings into it. Like even AI struggle in this space, by definition, they would struggle and humans struggle. And so it's like the opportunity is vast.
Until AGI comes, then we cut back to this clip and all that stuff's been replaced.
You guys going to cut this clip, download, re-upload, and like a propaganda starts.
The most valuable model is actually the one that predicts when AGI is going to hit, so that you can optimize all of your work towards retiring by then, or at least, being nice to machines in the few years leading up to it, which might be right now. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe next year. I always, be very polite with any LLM I interact with. Waymos, I have the right of way. I'm just like, go ahead.
Like, we're like, we need to kill this guy off. He's a terribly inefficient driver.
Yeah. My electric toothbrush, I replace the head. I like clean it out nicely. Like I give it its own little charging stand.
Yeah, I don't even use it.
Yeah.
You brush it. It's not.
Yeah.
It
It doesn't brush my teeth. I brush its teeth for sure.
New battery, like every 6 months.
Yeah. So I know we jumped kind of like directly into like AI, and you mentioned you kind of started leveraging LLMs later on at Nextdoor, but kind of want to maybe talk about like when you first started there, your first year or two there, what kind of approaches were you using with respect to like methodology to understand human language? Like I understand that you're kind of using these groups of people to kind of, I guess, test or like evaluate your models. But what was like your technique for actually like trying to understand what this comment or post is about?
Yeah, so I started at Nextdoor back in 2019, I believe. Yeah, 2019. And so that was still a little bit before the chat GPTs of the world. Like actually GPTs still existed, but GPT back then wasn't even as good as BERT, which actually BERT at the time was the
kind of new,
leading...
right? So like 2017 or 2018 or something, right?
GPT or BERT?
BERT.
I think BERT was like 2018, maybe 2017. The BERT paper came out, and then the attention paper, which is what the foundational paper for like all of AI today. Need. Right? Yeah, attention is all you need. Came out like a year before that, and BERT was the real first like large scale implementation of attention. Shout out to Devlin, I believe, at Google. He amazing. Like he did a lot for the field. But yeah, like that was kind of the change from like NLP being a unique to each application situation to like, okay, we're all just going to use these embeddings that these giant models are producing now, because there's simply no way that we're going to build, a transformer or an LLM big enough to match the likes of like Google and now OpenAI, right? Like, if you're going to take an embedding model, you're going to take one where it's all been built out for you and the weights of the model are already like, optimized.
Yeah.
And we're going to use those embeddings and use that to embed our text, right? And so for context, like an embedding is essentially just this string of numbers that represents a set of latent features. Like we don't know what those features are, but maybe a feature is like, does this have like a question in the text or not, right? That could be a latent feature, but it's not really going to be as human understandable as that. It's more, that's the kind of thing that it tries to capture in these embeddings. And attention is the mechanism by which it does that. And so if you're interested, go read about attention. But we use that to create these numerical representations of what text means, right? And so you can fine tune these models to make it more specific to your domain. But at the end of the day, those embeddings are really foundational upon a model that someone else built, like a bigger company with more compute resources. So back then we were using that as kind of the data of turning text into actual numbers. And then that's how we would target whether or not, like we would apply labels to that, right? So this piece of text is good or this piece of text is not good. And we would use those in our models to detect whether, stuff should or should not be removed from the platform. And so the label that we used back then when I actually first started the company was whether a piece of content had been reported by a user for any of our content report reasons. There was a specific subset of reasons called like hurtful and harmful, which were the ones that we were trying to optimize out of the platform. And Nextdoor was also a user moderated platform. And so the labels of whether that piece of content eventually got moderated and removed was another layer for a second model that was supposed to be a bit higher precision, but a bit lower recall.
So was it like you looked at like historically, these are the embeddings of the content that were reported, make a post right now. And if the embedding of my content looks similar to those ones that have been reported previously, has some probability of like someone's probably going to report that. Is that how that kind of worked with respect to like what you're kind of training against?
Yeah, exactly. And so you have this set of numbers. They almost look like a big long chain of lottery numbers, right? And so you have another piece of content that comes through that is also a set of numbers. If those numbers are pretty close to this other number with respect to kind of the direction it exists in this latent feature space, then we would prompt it to get automatically reported.
Gotcha.
And so it still go to kind of moderator review and then go through that whole moderation process.
Yeah.
But some stuff that would not get reported would now get reported. And then for the actual moderation as well, if something looked like something that was removed, looked like pieces of content that were often removed, then we would also add a moderator vote in the direction of like, remove or keep.
Gotcha.
And so that posed its own interesting problem because crowdsourcing your labels from people is often not 100% effective. Like some stuff, like a report is a very high intent action. I see stuff that's offensive online every day of the week, and I'm not going and reporting
you follow
every
high on
single
Twitter?
one of those. Yeah, exactly. And you can actually only report someone like a few times. It's limited. And so, stuff gets underreported. People also weaponize reports. Someone sees some piece of content by someone that they don't like or,
just disagree with, even though it's reasonable.
Yeah, exactly. And they'll report them. And
like
so
those goddamn people who don't want to target in Tahoe, right? Report the hell out of them, dude. Jeez. Take it down, Nextdoor.
Well, even even like what do you call that? Like for example, like Yelp, right? Like you can imagine a business would report another business for
Sure.
competitive reasons. It's not just like, hey, this is generally good or not good. It's like, hey, I want to get you out of my comp sets.
Exactly. Yeah. And so if that's your ground truth and that's the kind of stuff you're using to build models against, like it's going to perpetuate that kind of behavior. I mean, for the most part, you imagine that reports and removals are virtual content that is offensive, but you do have subsets of that which are just incorrect. And so you're perpetuating the accurate and the inaccurate parts of it. And so that's kind of, we talked about this earlier, but that's kind of why we shifted over to a more rigorous kind of panel labeling process. And just like all content moderation, it always comes back to manual labeling.
Gotcha.
So interesting. I mean, like, hey, audience, if any of you work at other platforms that are dealing with this sort of problem, we would love to hear from you about what you've, what's the latest and greatest that you've achieved.
Yeah, drop it in the
a comment below.
comments. And we'll also
Yeah.
drop in the comments a list of podcasts around data science that you got to report, because there's a lot of harmful content out there. And if you're listening to anything that's not Data Neighbors, you're probably consuming some hateful stuff. So we'll drop some links.
Please go and report those. What is the government organization that shuts down like misinformation?
But yeah, I don't know. I don't
They
know.
probably got rid of that one, actually.
I
Never
don't think
mind.
that exists anymore, man. That one. All the other organizations reported that one.
Exactly. They're just like, this one won't get off my ass.
And by the way, if Sugin does not accept your request on Instagram, you can just report his account.
I'm going to get doxxed for being on this podcast.
Man.
So you talked about how later on when like GPT 3.5 stuff came in, you started to leverage LLM as kind of another judge in the panel to help with trust and safety. Did you happen to see, like on the flip side, did you see like LLMs introducing any new risks in terms of like harmful content? Like, I don't know if this happened on Nextdoor, but I mean, I imagine in general on like the social media space.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we were at a point of sophistication where we were able to detect AI generated content yet. But I do think that it's a very significant risk with like LLMs as powerful as like, GPT and whatever Anthropic's putting out as well. I think Sonnet, right?
Yeah.
Is that there are identities that can be created that are incredibly compelling. And those are very good at influencing people, right? I think we as humans, if we hear a lot of people saying the same thing, we tend to believe that thing. Sometimes with less thought than we should really apply to that thing.
Right.
So LLMs are really good at scaling that up.
A lot of people think the world is round. It's freaking crazy, dude. Why? Because like 10 of your friends said it's round? Okay. How come I can see the line right there? Center of the world.
The line is like curved though, right? So is it like a Pringle? Is it shaped like a Pringle?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, it's not like it's totally flat, It's really old. Yeah. It's going to sag on the sides. Like, it's like a piece of paper kind of like.
Yeah. It can't
like wood.
Flat.
Wood kind of get, when you get like water on it, it kind of like bends on the side because it rains a lot. I know it's like a little drier these days, but it rains a lot in certain places in the world, and there's a lot of ocean water, so water weight's probably soaking down.
That's true, actually. I mean, in San Diego, it doesn't. In my suburb, it doesn't rain as much, so I feel like the horizon's a bit flatter than where you see it in other parts of the world.
I'm really excited for kind of like the agentic AI, so I can just start getting this message out there because. I mean,
you joke about that, but that's, that is the truth of it, right? Like, this kind of stuff is often like who says it louder and more often. And now, instead of one person saying it really loud and really often, that one person can now be 1,000 people, 10,000 people, however much you want to pay OpenAI in tokens number of people, right? And so, I think that is a huge risk. And something I'm hoping that the the safety team at OpenAI is addressing. Shout out to the safety team at OpenAI because it's made up mostly of the safety team that was at Nextdoor, like those guys I love, and, I hope they're doing a good job. They're really smart guys. And so I have faith that they're trying to address that at the very least.
I've got another kind of language question. Like, language is constantly evolving, new slang or subtle forms of like harassment. How did the work you do kind of like stay adaptable to changes over time? Were there like new versions of BERT that accounted for that? Do you kind of get what I'm getting at here? Like how I don't know, something that used to be like an insult isn't anymore, or vice versa?
Yeah. I get what you're asking. It's an interesting one, because if you are just looking at it from a, like, where we are at the moment, like LLMs are kind of like dumb model in the sense that it doesn't retrain itself, right? Like you train it and then you release it, and then it's like, oh, I was trained back in 2024, and so if you ask me about what's happening in 2025, I won't know, right? And so, yeah, those kinds of models, you do have to retrain. And that was kind of what we were doing with the ML team was doing with fine tuning for these BERT models. And so you have your base BERT model that, for the most part, language doesn't change, right? Like the only small parts of the language, like you were saying, like slang and that kind of stuff. Sure, it's a part of our day-to-day communication, but it's not changing the lexical structure of a sentence. And so most of it is still going to be relevant. And so that's why you fine tune and you kind of go through and change some of the final layers of the embedding so that it can understand what new combinations of tokens like actually mean. And one application that I thought was pretty cool was it learned that the clown emoji was like an insult, right?
Yeah,
like
that's actually a good one. Yeah.
Yeah. Like if you sent a message and like it could capture sarcasm in the sense that the clown emoji is often sent as sarcasm too, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, like clearly the earth is flat or whatever you want to do with like the clown emoji at the end.
Yeah.
So we were noticing it coming up when we were like filtering for the highest scoring, like offensive or uncivil comments, was the clown emoji showing up a lot. And so if you frequently fine tune, you'll be able to pick up on those little things. I actually think one of the primary challenges was when people mixed languages together in either the same comment or in the same discussion thread. Because, and this is definitely an edge case, but for example, in German, like die just kind of means the, right? Like, but obviously in English, it's die. And so someone was talking about, I know, like the boomer population, they were like, the boomer. And obviously it said in English, die boomer. And so it picked up on that and was like, oh, there's a death threat here. But it was just, someone referring to a certain generation of people. You can argue whether you find boomer offensive or not. That's outside this scope of this discussion, but
or not listen to this podcast.
Yeah. But obviously a death threat and the word the is very different. Types of content information too. And so you do have to get bigger. Like I think these days the root is always bigger model. Like if you had a bigger model that could pick up on the fact that it was German, then yeah, like you'd probably be able to get away with that. But at the time we were using kind of like smaller, older models. And so yeah, I think that is definitely going to evolve as we get to more intelligent models where it can almost look at the piece of content and its own judgment at another meta level where it's like, okay, these ones in the past had clown emojis. These ones in the past also have clown emojis, but now they're actually referring to different contexts,
right?
Because of the stuff around it. And so now I can understand that something's changed in this conversational dynamic. And so I think models will get to the point where they can start picking up on those and like having their own like meta judgments. And that's definitely a step on the way to AGI.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting edge case. Really like shifting gears a little bit, but still in line what we're talking about. While you're at Nextdoor, you contributed to a research paper focused on the impact of content moderation and transparency on user behavior. I think one of the insights of your paper was, like letting users know when their comments are filtered or removed and how that can kind of have an impact on behavior. Could you walk us a little bit through how you and your team had discovered this and why it matters?
Yeah, it's the feature that we were examining was comment filtering, or some people call it gray boxing. But whenever kind of a comment thread received an inflammatory comment, that comment and all of its replies would automatically be hidden for users with a button at the top of the, at the post level, that would say unhide all comments and unfilter all comments. And then you get a checkbox saying, are you sure you want to do this? There might be, racist or, offensive content in here. And then if you click yes, it would show the comments again. And so I believe what we did was a regression discontinuity design. The reason was the metrics we were measuring weren't the metrics that were logged in the experiment, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so we did like the before and after each rollout phase, and then compared in that shorter period of time. And so it was pretty simple ANOVA, just looking at whether or not people's activity changed, or when they were exposed to the filter feature or when they weren't exposed. And we ended up with null results, which is, I guess, also an interesting finding in the sense that, oh, hey, like we're filtering these comments out and it's not really doing anything to the activity of these people. Yeah. And so maybe that exposure to this kind of content at the comment level isn't enough to get them to move away, because we weren't doing anything with posts, which get most of the views as well. And so it's like, perhaps with content moderation, it's very much a perception thing. Like if you're viewing it twice a week versus one time a week, it doesn't really make much of a difference. But if you're viewing it once a week and not at all, it makes a huge difference, right? Some like non-linearity in the effect of negative content on people, I think.
That itself is pretty interesting observation, or I guess hypothesis, right? Like you can effectively devise the next set of problems or intuitions to validate with, like, hey, if that were true, then I would do X, Y, and Z sort of treatment for people. And then we would retest and see if that's true. And so, I mean, like, you were basically a one-man show doing all of the example stuff that you just talked about. There's a lot of different avenues that you've explored. And even for the stuff that you haven't, in your opinion, what's the biggest impact area that data science can drive in the whole trust and safety space?
Yeah, a bit tongue-in-cheek in my response to this one is that convincing people to do it in the first place is probably where the most of the impact actually comes from. Trust and safety and moderation and this kind of stuff is always going to be red on the balance sheet. Like, we're not really bringing in new users by like removing bad content. Like we could be, but it's hard to detect.
Yeah.
Also, it costs us money, right? Like we have to have a whole trust and safety team, which we support and pay for expensive engineers and data scientists and manual workers as well, like the labelers and all this kind of stuff too. And so I think one of the things at Nextdoor was trying to derive the long-term impact of exposure to this kind of content on users' capacity to retain.
Yeah.
So having that like foundational understanding that bad content causes people to leave actually drives investment and money and lifeblood into the trust and safety team, where we can actually do all of these other like knock-on things. And so for sure, I think, for people in trust and safety out there that want their companies to invest more in it, the first thing you have to do is convince leadership that it is a priority. Because we went from, kind of being a team that wasn't being funded that much to a company level OKR. And that's a huge difference in the perception of our team in the company. And so that's the first one. But unfortunately, all of that work doesn't actually go to reducing this content at all, right? It's like you got to get over the politics and the human side of operating a business, and that is just the practicality of the job. And I think, So to think about the ongoing value of data science in this area, like I think data science is really valuable because it's very flexible in how it can like answer questions, right? Like data science is built to answer ambiguous questions. And this whole podcast, we've been talking about how ambiguous this area is.
Yeah.
We're not essentially drawing a line from the beginning to the end and just being like, okay, like this leads to that, right? We are course correcting as we go. We had like our old labels for reported content from, which we crowdsourced from our users. We found that wasn't particularly accurate. And so we're like, okay, we can combine that with some labeling from one of our internal employees. Okay, well, one of our employees doesn't seem to agree with the other one. So now we make that 4 employees. Okay, it starts getting, a bit expensive. So maybe we bring in like an LLM and that kind of stuff too. But at every single step of the way, we have to show like where the efficacy is coming from, right? Like, okay, we seem to be capturing more of this type of content, and we need to come up with new ways of measuring success as we go as well, right? Like we don't always have that ground truth label. So maybe we take a third-party model and then we compare where our overlap is with that third-party model.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of these different steps require a data scientist to build the evaluation framework and do the actual analysis that shows whether or not we're heading from that start towards the end in the right direction. And so instead of our path being straight, it's very wiggly, right? Like for us to get there, and we're still on the route towards getting there. And so it's probably a similar answer to a lot of other data scientists out there, but it's really to help mitigate that and mitigate that ambiguity and, have us at least moving generally in the right direction.
Yeah, you mentioned trust and safety, like on the books is always going to be in the red, at least in the short term, which is what the books reflect quarter a year. Though we've been talking about it in the context of like social media, I wonder what it looks like for like these AI companies though.
I think it's more concerned about being upstream of something that is harmful and illegal.
Mm-hmm.
So, like on their side, they have to ensure before it goes out into the wild that it's not going to provide avenues for, like we were saying earlier, like impersonation or, influence. If you're detecting that it's trying to create 1,000 fake identities saying the same thing, like that is an attack vector that they need to like cover for, right? And so I think trust and safety for them does look very different. And I think trust and safety for them is incredibly policy driven. Like they can't let it get out in the wild and be like, oh yeah, this is a bad thing. Like we'll fix it next patch. Like it kind of doesn't work like that. And so I think that's also a risk too, right? Because like, unfortunately, like the robots, we're all human and we have a lot of like blind spots and unknown unknowns. And there are always creative ways to use anything in a bad way. And unless the most creative people in the world that can think of every single avenue work at OpenAI or work at Anthropic, then you're not going to cover all of those base use cases. And so I think it needs to be a very sophisticated upstream procedure that will hopefully filter out 99% of the bad use cases, and then a very responsive and reactive team that can detect further abuses of those use cases as they go out so that immediate patches can be done to like fix that 1% of things. It's very optimistic, I think, to think that is something they will always prioritize over everything else.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm biased. I think that's something that should be prioritized over everything else.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think anything defensive is hard to prove, quote unquote, like it's harder to prove value, but then they're so important. And like, maybe I would get your opinion on this. It's like, what sort of quality do maybe like the leaders in companies when they think about like defensive mechanisms, like, like, hey, trust and safety is important. Like, what advice do you have for them to, hey, don't don't ever fall for the euphoria of just, growth, for example.
I guess like the easiest way to relate is probably I like talking to someone that has suffered from like a lack of diligence in that area, right? Like if you are a financial provider like Cash App and you're a leader at Cash App, then maybe you should go and talk to someone who's been defrauded on Cash App and try and understand like, the impact that it's having. I think it's very easy for leaders to, and like I'm not saying like I'd be good at it either, but it's very easy to look at the scale of things and like kind of look at your checks and balances and being like, oh, okay, like only 1% of people are being affected by this, or 0.01% of people are being affected by this. And, we don't have to think about it right now.
Right.
And like maybe mathematically on that scale, that is kind of the right thing to do. But think about like at least have that trade-off thought and have that trade-off balance as well. And then I don't know if the emotional side of things is the driver for a lot of leaders too, but understanding kind of the impact and the knock-on effect that it can have, right? Like maybe on Nextdoor, it's not as big of a deal if someone gets offended and then just kind of signs off Nextdoor. But I know, like, I think Cash App takes trust and safety way more seriously when it comes to that kind of stuff, because fraud is actually, it could ruin someone's life, right? Like, it could ruin someone's credit. They could lose so much more than just, like have so much worse than just a bad evening or like a bad week. So yeah, those are, I guess, it's very difficult to convince leadership to do what you want when it loses them money. And again, the best way is probably to go back to the data and show them that they could actually lose money. And even if the net isn't net positive money for them, the net might be closer to a level where they can tolerate that loss to reduce this kind of emotional burden on their customers.
All right. Almost out of time here. I have one more question. What's like the most underrated skill that someone should invest in, whether they're starting a career or trying to excel in their career as a data scientist, in your opinion?
Good question, actually.
I think their tennis game, maybe?
Yeah, like probably the backhand.
One-handed, like not two-handed, like one-handed just looks better, I know it's not as powerful, but it just looks so nice.
You should like play with two-handed when it matters, because it's a stronger shot, but one-handed when you're trying to look good in front of people.
If there's a photographer there, you're gonna want,
I didn't know he had a one-hander. He doesn't. Honestly, I think you probably had this as well, Sean, but presenting, right? Like data science is always about being like, I hate this phrase, but there's no other really place, like a thought partner to the like product and influencing and convincing. And you've done all this great work in Python or SQL or like, building your models, building your dashboards, all this kind of stuff. And then you get to the actual presentation of it and you spend 30 minutes talking about embeddings and LLMs. And then leadership's like, what's this dummy doing? Like, I don't really understand. He spent like 6 months on this.
Get this dummy out of here and send him to Cash App.
That's right. That's what happened. And so, yeah, like just making sure that you really understand what the question you're answering, right? Just being like, okay, I was asked this question and this is the answer and this is what we should do. And honestly, the presentation can be as simple as that. You don't need to go out of your way to prove your credentials and show how much like modeling and dashboarding, this kind of stuff you did. It's just like being able to convey that. And, for me, I think consulting helped with that. As much as I didn't enjoy being in consulting, it definitely taught me some valuable skills. And I think that's the one that has made a lot more impact, because I can present like a compelling case, right? Like back to the like, why should we invest in trust and safety thing? Like, this is very straightforward, right? Why should we invest in trust and safety? Well, it loses the customers in the long run, and so we're going to lose money from it. We should invest in it because the net, we're going to make money. Like that's pretty much all you need to say.
Yeah, actually, I just have a follow-up question, just to try and help get this episode trending a little bit more. Is there any way you think AI could help you get better at that skill of presenting?
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely. So I think that's where High's point earlier comes in about like your job security. It can definitely write a more compelling case than you can, but you need to tell it like what you're trying to accomplish, right? And so it's also the fundamental underpinning of why I said presenting is really like understanding what you're trying to say and telling someone that thing. And maybe AI can help you tell that thing better than you can, but it's not going to know unless you give it every single model you've built and every single dashboard you've built and just be like, tell me what I can learn from this, right? Like that isn't a practical way of using AI. And so maybe try it. If anyone's listening and they want to try that, I'm really curious to find out if you give it like every single piece of code that you built for like a 6-month project and ask it to talk to an exec, then like, does that work or not?
For the audience out there, we did an episode on storytelling with Josh Starmer from StatQuest, who taught everybody how to tell really compelling stories. And so we'll link the video above. It's really, really practical.
I didn't know you guys had him on. He's cool.
Yeah.
I
took a lot of tips. I took a lot of tips from that episode. That's why this episode feels so much like a romantic comedy. I don't know if you guys noticed that. I curated that. That didn't happen naturally. I made all that happen after that episode. So that's why that's like that.
Awesome. That was a great episode. I hope people are inspired for the ones who are interested in the trust and safety area or things that are a little more ambiguous by nature. And so for the audience out there, if you like or found this episode valuable, please like, subscribe, and put in any comments. We'll address all of them, and we'll bring you more episodes like this in the future. Thank you so much, Sugin, for spending the time with us.
Yeah, thanks, Sugin. And Hi, I'll get your check in the mail. We do it bi-monthly. So it's, we're recording on the 6th. So I think you probably will hit the next pay period. Thanks for joining.
Awesome.
Well, I know where you guys live. So, well, thanks for having me. I had a great time. It was a great little stroll down memory lane with a couple of the old gang. And so it was nice to catch up, and I definitely miss you guys.
Cool. See you too. Thanks, listeners.
Bye.